Hi everyone. So today's video was originally planned to be out by June because I wanted this to be like a Pride Month special type of thing. But as I sat down to finally write this video, I realized that it might take a bit longer than that. So if this gets out by June, then great. Happy Pride Month. If not, then happy post-Pride Month. I guess. Hope you had a good Pride Month if you celebrated. Hopefully it hasn't been too long since June. Today's video is about this ginormous book. A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. Published in 2015, Hanya Yanagihara's second novel, A Little Life, follows the stories of four friends, Jude, Willem, Malcolm, and JB, as they navigate their lives through adulthood and old age. The 800-page novel follows them through every stage of life from college to old age to their eventual deaths, but eventually end up focusing mainly on Jude, as the story is mostly told from his perspective. Now, I actually started reading this book about 2 years ago when I saw it trending on TikTok. This book went viral on TikTok a couple years ago. People were calling it the saddest book ever written. People were posting videos of themselves bawling their eyes out over this book. So I became intrigued and decided to pick it up. Upon doing a bit more research into it, I was overwhelmed by the amount of praise and critical acclaim it received. After being published in 2015, it almost instantly became a bestseller. It has won some of the biggest and well-known awards when it comes to novels and works of fiction, such as the Kirkus Prize. It was a finalist for the National Book Award and the Man Booker Prize. It has excellent ratings and reviews. In December of 2021, it was nominated for the best book of the past 125 years by the New York Times, next to novels like To Kill a Mockingbird, 1984, The Grapes of Wrath, The Great Gatsby, Lolita, The Handmaid's Tale, The Catcher in the Rye, and Gone with the Wind. John McCoud from The New Yorker even went on to say, Martin Amis once asked, who else but Tolstoy has made happiness really swing on the page? And the surprising answer is that Hanya Yanagihara has. Counterintuitively, the most moving parts of A Little Life are not its most brutal but its tenderest ones, moments when Jude receives kindness and support from his friends. A Little Life feels elemental, irreducible, and dark and disturbing though it is, there is beauty in it. I mean, as a writer, I don't think you can get any higher praise than that. Yanagihara was literally being compared to Tolstoy. Her work is being regarded as being the same caliber as some of the timeless classics that is out there. A Little Life was even adapted into a theater play directed by Belgian theater Ivo van Hove. It screened last year in Amsterdam that you can watch online with English subtitles. Ramsey Najjar, the actor who played the role of Jude in this play, ended up winning the Louis d'Or Award, which is like the award given to the best actor in theater performance in Netherlands. Basically, this book is it, okay? That's what everybody is saying. We would be here all day if I were to go over every single praise that this book received. So instead, I would like to focus on this one article from The Atlantic by Garth Greenwell, who claimed that A Little Life is the great gay novel. No coverage of the book I've seen has discussed it as a novel fundamentally about gay lives, as the most ambitious chronicle of the social and emotional lives of gay men to have emerged for many years. Needless to say, I went into reading this book with a lot of high expectations, but as acclaimed as this book is, it has also garnered a lot of controversy because, as you'll see, the themes of this novel are extremely dark and disturbing. It has left a lot of people divided with polarizing opinions. You seem to either love it or hate it when it comes to this book, and I unfortunately hate it. As 2 years ago when I started reading it, I had to put it down about 3/4 of the way through because it just left me feeling so angry that I just could not carry on. So for nearly 2 years it sat at the back of my closet collecting dust. I almost forgot about it until this video by Criticism popped up in my recommended. I started watching it and all those feelings of frustration and anger that I initially felt towards this book resurfaced, which led me to finally picking this up again. So I read it, I finished it, I even reread some parts in preparation for this video, as you can see by the tabs sticking out. Some of the themes that this novel explores are very personal to me, that I have a lot to say about, that I've been avoiding, that I've been ignoring, that I've been trying to brush under the carpet. But in the spirit of Pride Month, I have finally decided to get it out and get it off my chest so I can move on, so I can live my life without thinking about this book. With that though, content warning, huge content warning for everything that is on the screen right now. I don't have the energy to read them all out. Making this video has already been exhausting enough for me, and I will be talking about these topics very openly and casually, uncensored. So if that's something that will bother you, please click off right now. You can go watch anything else from my channel or just go watch something else altogether. And also, spoiler warning, like if you're reading this book right now or are planning to read this book and don't want spoilers, then you should click off as well. So, A Little Life is set in downtown New York and centers around the lives of 4 young men: Jude Stead Francis, William Ragnarsson, Malcolm Irvine, and Jean Baptiste Marion, or JB for short. They were roommates in college and decided to stay friends after graduating, even though they all ended up pursuing completely different fields in terms of careers. Jude is a brilliant lawyer and a mathematician with a mysterious past. At the start of the novel, it was never mentioned where he came from, who his parents were, or who he was before he started his life in New York after finishing college. Willem is an aspiring actor who, in between auditioning for roles, works as a waiter to pay the bills. He's the handsome one of the group. Wherever he goes, he always gets the attention from women, even though he is disinterested in them. Willem is a son to Nordic parents who were uninvolved in his upbringing. His older brother, Hemming, was born with cerebral palsy, who his parents neglected, leaving Willem to take care of his brother. Like, his parents weren't abusive, they made sure that they were fed, clothed, had their basic needs met, but other than that, they weren't particularly loving or affectionate. They were cold and acted as if raising Willem and Hemming was a chore. So after Willem left for college, Hemming had no one to look after him, leading his health to deteriorate to the point he had to go on life support and then eventually dying. His parents died shortly after. His father passed away from a heart attack and his mother died of a stroke. Malcolm is the rich friend with a shit ton of money. He's the friend that has no problem lending money. Like, there was this one point in the novel where after Willem heard about Hemming being on life support, he wanted to fly back home to say his last goodbye, but he couldn't afford to book a flight. After confiding in Malcolm, he just pulls out his checkbook and writes him a check worth thousands of dollars and just hands it to him. No questions asked. He's the one with fuck you money, basically. But with that, Malcolm suffers from sort of an identity crisis. Because he grew up so rich, so privileged, always had everything that he ever needed and wanted, never had to struggle for anything, always had everything just handed to him, he didn't really know who he was. So he was very complacent and passive and just did what his parents wanted him to do, which was to study architecture and become an architect, which is what he did. The last character is Jean Baptiste, or JB for short. JB is an aspiring actor born to Haitian American immigrants. Although he never knew his father, he grew up extremely privileged, having went to a private school. His mom, being a single mom, was always busy with work and whatnot, but he was never neglected. He always felt loved and supported by his mother and grandmother, but yet he often felt like he needed to struggle in order to build his character and to really play out that tortured artist trope. So in high school, he would embellish his story to make himself seem worse off than he actually was. He would play out the stereotype of being a fatherless black boy whose mother had only completed school after he was born, leading people to assume that he meant high school when in reality it was grad school. And his aunt was always in the streets, insinuating that she was a prostitute when in actuality she worked as a detective. There is also Harold Stein, who is Jude's law professor, who later on adopts Jude at the age of 30 with his wife Julia, becoming Jude's legal parents. Harold had a child named Jacob who passed away at a young age due to some hereditary disease. It is assumed that Harold sees his late child in Jude, which is what led him to adopting him. He also plays a general father figure role to the rest of the group. And then there's Andy Contractor, an orthopedic surgeon who becomes Jude's carer, helping him through his chronic illnesses, both physical and mental. There are also several other characters. There is Richard, who is a property owner that works with JB, Jude's mentor Lucien, William's agent Kit, Malcolm's wife Sophie, the Henry Youngs, etc., who aren't really important as they don't have any significant dialogue. They're sort of just in the background of this story. I hope you have picked up on a pattern at this point. Almost every significant character in this novel so far has some kind of trauma, has a tragic backstory, and the ones that don't, like Malcolm and JB, are portrayed as vapid and shallow, almost as if Yanagihara believes that you need to suffer in order to be an interesting person, which is a shame because I think there was so much potential when it comes to character development, especially with Malcolm and JB. If anything, I actually found them to be relatable. I too remember being a people pleaser, being passive and complacent like Malcolm once when I was younger. How JB tries to be cool and exaggerate his story to fit in is something that I think a lot of us can relate to. It's something that we've all probably done at some point. The first couple chapters of this novel really tries to pretend to be this wholesome slice-of-life tale about 4 friends trying to find themselves and make it in the city of New York. There was this overly detailed description of this Vietnamese place that the 4 of them used to go to out of habit and necessity. Even though the food wasn't very good, it would always make them sick. They still kept going because that's all they could afford at that point. It felt like Yanagihara was trying to build some kind of an inside joke, a secret handshake among the group that failed miserably, so she just abandoned it and we never heard about this Vietnamese shop ever again. The reason it didn't work is because the central focus of this novel turned to Jude. Right from the get-go, it was alluded that Jude's past trauma, his illnesses, his suffering was going to be one of the main themes of this novel. Jude has some kind of a disability on his legs. At the start, it was never explained what it exactly was or how it happened, but it would cause him intense debilitating pain to the point he would have to lie down, he would throw up from the pain, he would walk on a limp, sometimes using aids like a cane, crutches, or even a wheelchair to get around. We also find out that Jude self-harmed. He cut himself. It was said that he always wore long-sleeve shirts even during the summer, presumably to cover up his scars. There was this one scene where Jude woke William up in the middle of the night because he cut himself so bad, assumably he cut through an artery that he couldn't get the bleeding to stop. He had his arm wrapped up in a towel that was completely red. There was a very graphic depiction of Jude's wound when it was finally revealed. William ended up driving Jude to Andy's, where he was patched up and was given a glass of orange juice to replenish his nutrients, and it was never reported. Andy never contacts authorities, gets him institutionalized, he just patches him off and lets him go home. For a novel that was so heavily promoted as this moving tale about love and friendship among 4 young men, we rarely ever see them together. There were a lot of individual backstories about how the characters came about, but nothing about their friendship, nothing about how they met, the things they had in common, what drew them into each other to the point they decided to stay friends even after college. About a third of the way through the novel, the group decides to split up after a fight happens between JB and Jude. So basically what happened was, JB started hanging around the wrong crowd and ended up getting addicted to crystal meth. It got so bad that his friends had to stage an intervention to get him into rehab. During the intervention, JB gets really mad at Jude for some reason and starts mocking his disability, mocking the way he walked. It was very strange because it seemingly came out of nowhere. William punches JB in the face, which causes him to pass out, and then he wakes up in the hospital. Afterwards, he goes to rehab, joins Crystal Meth Anonymous, works to get clean and all that stuff. But even after he profusely apologized to Jude, Jude was never able to forgive him and decides to stop talking to JB. And because William was the closest to Jude among the 4 of them and has always been protective over him, after Jude decides to cut ties with JB, he does too, leaving Malcolm to be the only one to remain friends with all 4 of them. But after this incident, we rarely ever hear about Malcolm or JB ever again. JB practically just disappears and we never hear from him again until the very end of the novel. Malcolm also rarely ever shows up, and when he does, he is kind of in the background with no significant role to play to the plot. So we're not even a third of the way into the book yet, and it goes from being a story about 4 friends to a story about 2 friends. But as William's acting career starts to take off, he often has to leave and travel for work, leaving Jude to be the only one telling his story. So A Little Life is really about Jude. Most of the pages in this novel are dedicated to him, his story, his past, his suffering, and most of the content warning that I gave out at the start are involving him. As you can probably guess, it gets really heavy and excessive, which is one of the reasons why this novel has garnered quite a bit of controversy. It has left a lot of people questioning what Yanagihara's motives were in writing Jude's character or this novel as a whole. Some people defend this novel by saying that Jude's trauma and pain reflects reality. This is what happens in real life, and Yanagihara is just giving an unfiltered, uncensored version of what it looks like. I personally think that is a terrible excuse, and I'm going to explain why that is. So, like I said before, A Little Life is mostly about Jude and the trauma that he goes through. We finally learn about his past and what happened to him about halfway through the novel. It is presented as this utter, unspeakable tragedy that is supposed to leave you speechless, but in my opinion, I think it's a bit overdone, to the point it doesn't even feel real. Like, it feels almost comical. At some point, it just stops being tragic and starts being funny. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let me give you a little summary of Jude's A Little Life. So, as a baby, Jude was abandoned in or next to a dumpster where he was rescued by a bunch of Catholic priests, but because he had no record, nobody knew when he was born, who his parents were, or what race he was even, he couldn't get adopted and ended up staying at the monastery with the Catholic priests. The priests were very strict with him. They would beat him as punishment and would often sexually abuse him. Only one of the priests, Brother Luke, was kind to him, but reading through Jude's interactions with Brother Luke, it becomes obvious that Brother Luke was also grooming him by giving him presents and planning to run away with him. On his 9th birthday, Jude escapes the monastery with Brother Luke, who promised him of going to a cabin in the woods where he would be free to run around and do whatever he wanted without any punishment. But in reality, Brother Luke took him to a motel where he pimped him out to pedophiles. So Jude was sold as a child prostitute by Brother Luke, where he was again sexually abused. Brother Luke also keeps him as his personal sex slave who he uses whenever he wants to. They both travel all over the country, going to different motels, doing the same thing, constantly moving around in order to avoid getting into trouble with the police. Obviously, this whole experience was extremely traumatic for Jude, during which he would throw himself into walls, trip over stairs to cope with the anger and shame that he felt while doing this. But then he would end up with bruises which would turn away the clients that they were having. Brother Luke then shows him how to cut himself as an alternative way to cope, which is how his habit of self-harming begins. The police eventually catches up with Brother Luke, and when he hears them banging on their door, Brother Luke locks himself up in the bathroom and hangs himself. Afterwards, Jude was placed in a home where he is treated poorly by the counselors there, who again sexually abuse him. Jude eventually runs away from this home and tries to escape as far away as he can. He hitchhikes all over the country in exchange for his body. So he was now prostituting himself to truck drivers for a ride or a bit of money or food or anything for him to be able to survive out on the streets. This goes on for a couple months, during which Jude ends up catching a lot of venereal diseases, STDs. One day he passes out on the streets due to complications from these diseases. He was then nursed back to health by a psychiatrist named Dr. Trailer, who after treating Jude, keeps him locked in his basement where he sexually abuses him. This continues until his 15th birthday. On his 15th birthday, Dr. Trailer finally promises to let Jude go under one condition. He drives him over to this field, gets him out of his car, and tells him that if he could outrun him as he chases him with his car, he would let him go, which goes exactly how you'd expect. Dr. Trailer ends up running Jude over with his car on his legs, which is how he got his leg injury. After that, Jude wakes up in a hospital where he gets treated. He works with a social worker named Anna who tries to get him justice and get his life back on track. Anna was the first person in a long time who was nice to Jude, who really wanted the best for him, who did not sexually abuse him, so of course she had to die. But despite everything, Jude still manages to get his life in order. He gets his high school diploma and goes to college where he meets Willem, Malcolm, JB, Harold, Andy, etc. all those people. Things start to go well for him, except that due to his sexual trauma, he was never able to get into relationships with people. After he turned 40, his friends and family became really concerned as to why he has never been in a relationship. So he finally caves into their pressure, and also to cope with the crippling loneliness that he was feeling due to Willem constantly traveling around for shoots, Jude gets into a relationship with Caleb, who was a fashion designer. Caleb turned out to be really abusive to Jude. He was disgusted by Jude's disability. He even hits Jude at one point. After an incident where Caleb humiliates him in public at a restaurant in front of Harold, Jude finally breaks it off with Caleb, only to find him in his house waiting for him. Caleb ends up beating Jude to the point he had to be hospitalized, and then he sexually abuses him. This whole incident with Caleb ends up triggering Jude of his past trauma. It opens up a lot of old wounds to the point he attempts to take his life. After his attempt was unsuccessful, his loved ones stage an intervention where they keep a close eye on him. Willem ends up returning home and decides to stay for a bit longer to be close to Jude. They both get into a relationship. But as Jude gets older, his legs deteriorate. He experiences a lot of complications like burn infections and bruises, to the point his legs had to be amputated. So now he walked around in prosthetics. But despite that, things were finally looking up for him until Willem, Malcolm and his wife Sophie get into a car crash and dies. After William's death, Jude is left alone. He develops an eating disorder from his grief and tries to starve himself to death. He ends up losing so much weight that his prosthetics no longer fit him, so he was back to being on a wheelchair. His loved ones stage another intervention for him, where for a while he had to be fed through a tube because of how much weight he had lost. Although he eventually gains the weight back and starts going to therapy, he still remains moody and low-spirited. The last chapter is narrated from Harold's perspective, where we find out that at the age of 53, Jude's dad Francis has finally killed himself. And that was his little life. I'm sorry if I'm coming off as a bit callous, but hopefully you're seeing the point that I'm trying to make. Jude's story reminded me a bit of the book series called A Series of Unfortunate Events by Lemony Snicket, where after being orphaned, the main characters Violet, Klaus and Sunny go through a series of tragic events that are so unfortunate that it becomes comical. That kind of what happens to Jude. The things that he goes through, the series of events, are so horrific that it doesn't even feel real. The characters that torment him, Brother Luke, Dr. Trailer, Caleb, are not multifaceted characters with complex personalities. Rather, they're one-dimensional, cartoonish villains that are there just to torture him. Like the whole incident with Caleb, from meeting him to where Caleb beats him senseless and leaves him for dead, happens within the span of 30 pages. When Caleb shows up drunk, uninvited to the restaurant where Harold and Jude were having dinner, he goes up to Harold and says, "Be honest, don't you ever wish you had a normal son, not a cripple?" Who talks like that? These characters, they're so indistinguishable from each other that in the play, they're literally being played by the same actor. Jude gets sexually abused so much in this novel that it ceases to be shocking. Like, the first time it happens, it leaves you shocked, but the 100th time it happens, you're like, what the actual fuck? Like, Jude getting raped happens so much that it almost becomes a punchline. And again, it doesn't feel real. Like, you're telling me that every single monk at this monastery did it to him? A whole ass monastery? Like, do you even realize how big a monastery is? And when he gets put into this home, the counselors there do it to him too. And on the road, every single truck driver that he comes across is a pedophile. There was not a single person that genuinely wanted to help him. And what makes it even more unrealistic is how Jude turns out after. In the aftermath of all this trauma, Jude turns out completely fine. Aside from cutting himself every now and then, he doesn't suffer from any major symptoms. He becomes a brilliant lawyer, first working at the US Attorney Office, then switching to a private law firm where he becomes their chief litigator. He volunteers at an art organization. He is also a mathematician, majoring in maths at college and then getting a master's in pure math. He also sings and plays the piano. He is a baker, a great cook, a gardener, an incredible chess player. He is also really attractive. Now, look, I'm not saying that if you had major trauma early on in your life, you can't turn out okay. But in the case of Jude, how he turned out despite everything that he has been through, again, it doesn't feel realistic. Especially given that we never see Jude actually developing or working on the skills. There was never a moment where he struggles to learn a piano piece or feels nervous before presenting at court or makes mistakes while doing maths. Even with his social interactions, which keep in mind, Jude obviously did not have a normal childhood. He did not attend school. He did not spend much time with kids his age when he was younger. He probably didn't even have any friends as a kid. Yet, it is never reflected in his social interactions. He is never awkward or fails to read the room or anything. If anything, he comes off as charismatic. He goes from being a loving partner to Willem to a cold, cutthroat lawyer that everybody is scared of to being the perfect addition to Harold and Julia's family without having any work to do. Everybody loves him. He is constantly surrounded by so much love and support, and it's never explained why other than, oh, he's just really nice and kind, which, okay. And people just give things to him without expecting anything in return. Like at one point, Malcolm, the rich architect friend, after he becomes successful as an architect, he just casually builds Jude a house that is tailored to his needs, with ramps, with enough space for him to move around with his wheelchair. Jude, despite his trauma, is this perfect, flawless being that remains consistent all throughout the story. His mental and physical health problems never seem to interfere with his work or whatnot. There is no character arc, no struggles that he overcomes. He's essentially a Gary Sue character, which is the male version of a Mary Sue. And that made this novel so fucking boring to read. And on the topic of Jude being surrounded by so many people that love and adore him, but when it comes to actually helping him in terms of his trauma and disability, these people prove to be useless. Jude is surrounded by some of the most intelligent and professional people there is, with Harold being his law professor, Lucien who is his mentor, and Andy who is an orthopedic surgeon that he is good friends with. Yet all these people seem to walk on eggshells when it comes to his trauma. It's like this elephant in the room that no one seems to address. At best, they infantilize him even when he is a grown adult in his 40s, and at worst, they continue to enable his self-destructive behavior by turning a blind eye to it. Like at one point in the novel, when Jude was in his 40s, his legs begin to deteriorate due to old age as he begins getting bruises and burn infections. He was ordered strictly to stay on bed rest, yet he chooses to go for a walk in the forest. Harold goes with him, and he's not even halfway to the first bench when his legs begin to hurt. He doesn't say anything, he keeps going until the pain is so severe that he can no longer walk on his own without holding on to Harold. And Harold is an old man himself, so at some point he had to leave Jude in the middle of the forest to get help. While Harold was gone, Jude feels so dizzy that he falls over, vomits, and Willem had to carry him home, where they all lose their minds trying to take care of him. Someone takes off his shoes and he screams out and is apologized to. Someone wipes his face. Someone wraps his hands around a hot water bottle. Someone wraps his legs with blankets. Above him, he can hear Willem being angry. Why did you fucking go along with this? You know he can't fucking do this. And Harold's apologetic, miserable replies, I know, Willem, I'm so sorry. It was moronic, but he wanted to go so badly. He tries to speak, to defend Harold, to tell Willem it was his fault that he made Harold come with him, but he can't. This is a 45-year-old man. Why is everyone babying him? Like if I were Jude, I would have been so annoyed by all this infantilization, and this is consistent all throughout the story. Even at the start, in the very first chapter, when they were straight out of college in the process of moving into their first apartment in New York, when Jude's legs began to hurt, his so-called friends just walked away and acted like everything's fine. They were talking, but Jude's eyes were closed, and Willem knew from the constant hummingbird flutter of his eyelids and the way his hand was curled into a fist so tight Willem could see the ocean green threads of his veins jumping under the back of his hand that he was in pain. He knew from how rigid Jude was holding his legs, which were resting atop a box of books, that the pain was severe, and knew that there was nothing he could do for him. If he said, "Jude, let me get you some aspirin," Jude would say, "I'm fine, Willem, I don't need anything." And if he said, "Jude, why don't you lie down?" Jude would say, "Willem, I'm fine, stop worrying." So finally he did what they had all learned over the years to do when Jude's legs were hurting him, which was to make some excuse, get up and leave the room so Jude could lie perfectly still and wait for the pain to pass without having to make conversation or expend energy pretending that everything was fine and that he was just tired or had a cramp or whatever feeble explanation he was able to invent. This is not okay. At no point his so-called friends and loved ones put their foot down and say, "Jude, you clearly have some issues and we're going to get you help." No, instead they go along with it, enabling his self-destructive behavior and not doing anything until it's too late. All they do is apologize and act hopeless like, "Oh, poor Jude, there is nothing that I could do to help him." Andy, in my opinion, is the absolute worst when it comes to these enablers. Andy is Jude's orthopedic surgeon and personal doctor who Jude goes to whenever he needs anything. He seems to be able to just walk in and out of Andy's office at any time of the day without needing an appointment. Throughout all these years, Jude becomes unhealthily dependent on Andy, going to him for every health issue, every time he self-harms, he cuts himself, and no matter how bad it is, Andy just patches him off and lets him go home. He never reports them, he never contacts authorities, he never sends a wellness check on him. If this were real life, Andy would have had his license to practice taken away at the very least for negligence. It is so confusing because on one hand, Jude has all these people that say that they love and support him to the point they even legally made him a part of their family, like Harold and Julia adopting Jude at the age of 30. That doesn't happen in real life. You don't go around adopting 30-year-olds just because you like them, but when it comes to actually doing something that would genuinely help him, it's all crickets. They're all complacent to his suffering, and it's not like they can't intervene. They can, they've done it twice, only when Jude was on the verge of death. Other than that, they just enable him and let him suffer. While Jude may be surrounded by loved ones, he still lacks a sense of community, a community of like-minded people that would understand him and hold him accountable, which brings me to my next point. There is no sense of community in this novel. Like everything seems to be happening in a vacuum with no outside influence. Jude is a disabled lawyer who does pro bono work at an art organization. There were times where it was said that he presents his cases whilst being on a wheelchair. That's something that you don't see very often. Yet everybody seems to be okay with it. Nobody ever questions it. Jude doesn't even get weird looks from people. There was no mention of Jude experiencing discrimination because of it at any point in his career. It just seems to be smooth sailing. The story is set in New York, but it was never specified when in New York it was. Given that it was published in 2015, it can be assumed that it takes place in that year, but it spans over years, decades as we go through Jude's life, which seems to be occurring in a separate universe that is exempt from any major world events. There is no mention of 9/11, nothing about the Iraq wars, no financial crash. In fact, every single character in this novel turns out to be extremely successful. Jude becomes the chief litigator of a private law firm. Willem ends up being an A-list celebrity that gets recognized in public. JB becomes a famous artist by drawing photorealistic images of the mundane moments of their lives, which is odd in an age where photographic technology is so abundant. And Malcolm also gains tremendous success in his field of architecture. All these incredibly competitive fields, law, acting, art, architecture, and every single one of them end up being incredibly successful in these fields. Again, what are the odds of this happening? There is a lot of description of the kind of lives they live after they become successful, lots of luxurious holidays they go to, large beautiful homes they live in, scrumptious foods they eat. Like, if you like reading about rich people doing rich people things, this might be the book for you. I've read some interviews with Yanagihara where she said that the fairy tale-like luxury is supposed to contrast the bleak, heart-wrenching past that Jude was living in, which is fine. She as the author can make these literary choices, but that doesn't make it realistic, does it? Ultimately, the central theme of this novel continues to be about Jude's trauma and suffering. No matter how successful he becomes, how much support he has, how much money he makes, he is still portrayed as this broken man who cannot be fixed. As readers, we're supposed to root for Jude, hope that he gets better by getting the help that he needs, but it never happens. And the more I kept reading A Little Life, the more it becomes obvious that this is how it's meant to be. This is deliberate, and it is influenced by Yanagihara's sinister beliefs on trauma and therapy. So, a bit of background on me before I get started on this section. One of the reasons why I was so drawn to this book in the first place is because I too have had experienced similar things to Jude. Albeit it wasn't as extreme as Jude, but I too have unfortunately experienced sexual abuse at a young age that I'm still traumatized about. I don't want to get into exactly what happened in too much detail, but over the last couple years, I have been intensively working towards healing and bettering myself. For me, finding communities of like-minded people, support groups have helped immensely, as well as educating myself on this issue has been very empowering. I'm obviously not an expert or a professional in this field by any means, but I would still say that I know a bit more about this topic than your average person. So when I heard about this book that was going viral, which was about a protagonist that goes through intense sexual abuse and trauma, I was intrigued. But as I started reading this, there were some parts that stood out to me that just did not feel right. For example, after Willem and Jude get into a relationship, Willem tries to have sex with Jude, but due to years of intense sexual trauma, Jude has completely lost his ability to get an erection, which interfered with their sex life. This stood out to me because that doesn't usually happen to survivors of sexual abuse, especially child sexual abuse. Yes, men, or rather people with penises, can experience sexual dysfunction after experiencing abuse, but you don't completely lose your ability to get an erection. Especially with men, what happens is that you experience hypersexuality, where oftentimes you lose control over that part of your body. You no longer have that mind-body connection, causing you to feel arousal at inappropriate times, participating in risk-taking behaviors, having erections that you have no control over. I'm sorry if that was a bit too much information for some of you, but this topic is really important and personal to me, as you can probably tell, and this sort of misinformation about abuse survivors bothered me quite a bit, because it reinforces the myth that people that have had these kinds of things done to them are broken and cannot be fixed, when that is simply not the case. You can go through the worst possible abuse imaginable and still turn out okay. You can still have healthy, loving relationships and a fulfilling sex life if that is what you want. It may take you some time to get there. You might need therapy, you might need some literal treatment on that part of your body, you might have to put in some work, but it's not entirely impossible. I had a gut feeling that despite writing an entire 800-page novel mostly about sexual abuse and trauma, Yanagihara had no idea what she was talking about, and upon doing a bit of research, I was right. In this interview with the Electric Literature, Yanagihara straight up admitted that she did no research for the character of Jude. Nothing about trauma, nothing about psychology, nothing about sexual abuse. When I first learned this, my jaw dropped onto the floor. Because one of the reasons why this book is as long as it is because there's just so much unnecessary details on mundane things that add nothing to the plot. I already talked about the Vietnamese restaurant that they used to go to in the first chapter, which was never brought up again. There is a lot of details about food in this book, about what foods the characters like, Jude making those foods, Jude making gojeres. I probably butchered that pronunciation, I'm so sorry. But it's this French pastry that Jude keeps keeps on making that for some reason is brought up numerous times. French-Canadian chef Anthony Porowski actually came up with a recipe for gougères that was inspired by Jude, which I thought was pretty cute. But there are entire characters that get introduced with immense details only to get tossed aside because Jude's suffering has to take center stage. I already talked about Malcolm and JB, but there was also this one point where William begins sleeping with this woman named Claudine, who was described with so much detail only to never get brought up again. The woman's name is Claudine, and she is a friend of an acquaintance, a jewelry designer, which is something of a deviation for him, as he usually only sleeps with people in the industry who are much accustomed to, more forgiving of, temporary arrangements. She is 33 with long dark hair that lightens at its tips and very small hands like a child, on which she wears rings that she has made, dark with gold and glinting with stones. Before they have sex, she takes them off last, as if these rings, not her underwear, are what conceal the most private parts of her. When I first read this, I was intrigued. I was like, ooh, that sounds interesting. Are we going to learn more about that? Why does she do that? What's her story? Nope. Aside from this chapter, she's never brought up again. In the acknowledgement section, Yanagihara thanks people for their expertise on the topics of architecture, law, medicine, and filmmaking. But the point that I'm trying to make with all this is that Yanagihara was able to do copious amounts of research on mundane, trivial things like food, architecture, law, and filmmaking that add nothing to the plot, but nothing on psychology, abuse, and trauma, which are like the central themes of this story. One of the reasons why there was no research done on the character of Jude is because Jude was intended to be a consistent character that doesn't change. He was deliberately written as this character that doesn't get better no matter what, that is broken beyond repair. While I understand how it can seem like that to most mentally healthy, untraumatized, normal people, but as someone who actually has lived through some of the things that Jude has, I really don't see it like that. Yes, what Jude has been through is extreme, but in my journey of healing my trauma, bettering myself, I have met people in communities, in support groups that went through arguably worse things than Jude has in real life, that were a lot worse off, yet have managed to turn their lives around. And it's not just that Jude can't be helped, it's that he doesn't want to be helped. Throughout this entire novel, he remains in a constant state of denial that he is fine, that he doesn't need help, which is enabled by everyone around him. At times, he doesn't even want to admit that he has a disability that might make day-to-day activities harder for him. He still tries to do the things that able-bodied, normal people would be able to do with ease without any help, which almost always ends badly for him. Like I already talked about the forest incident where he tries to take a walk through the forest despite having been ordered to stay on bed rest, which ended up with him getting so sick and being in so much pain that he had to be carried home. There was this other incident where he gets home late from work only to find out that the elevator was broken, and in this particular day he had to be on his wheelchair because his legs were already hurting so bad. Instead of calling for help, knocking on his neighbor's doors, doing the sensible thing, Jude tries to crawl up the stairs to his apartment on the 5th floor, holding his briefcase in one hand and lifting his heavy wheelchair with the other. And it goes exactly how you'd expect. He passes out on the staircase. When William gets home, he finds him convulsing on the floor, lying on his own vomit. There are a lot of very graphic scenes of Jude's suffering, about his wounds, about him vomiting, his cutting. There was this one point where, as an alternative to cutting, he gives himself a 3rd-degree burn on his arm. The whole novel is this endless cycle of Jude fucking up, doing something reckless, trying to pretend that he's fine, and when he can no longer pretend, his loved ones have to step in and help, to which he apologizes. Jude apologizes a lot throughout this novel, like half of all the dialogues that he has is just him saying that he's sorry but not doing anything to actually change his behavior. The first couple times it happens, you genuinely feel sorry for him, but when it's still going on 3/4 of the way of this book, when he's in his 40s, you really start to lose sympathy for him. As this article by Andrea Long-Chu by Fulcher puts it, the first time Jude cuts himself, you're horrified. The 600th time, you wish he would aim. And I know this sounds harsh, but especially with my background, it has been so infuriating to read. Over the years, I've known people that had to suffer because they couldn't afford to go to therapy. I've known people that had to decide between food and their medication. Some of the most insightful people I've known are stuck working in retail for the rest of their lives because they don't have the emotional bandwidth to go back to school. People that are barely making ends meet with drugs and alcohol as their only escape. See, this is the reality of trauma. Most of us don't get to become flashy upper-class lawyers in New York after living through something horrific. But Jude does. He's living in such privilege with so many resources under his fingertips, yet he just refuses to get help. I previously mentioned how Jude is essentially this Gary Sue character that is perfect without any flaws. He has it all, a great job, great hobbies, great friends and family that are there to love and support him. The way I interpreted it is that Jude is perfect in all sorts of ways, except for one thing that is his past that he needs to overcome. Which made this novel so frustrating to read because it never happens. Yanagihara dangles the carrot of hope at times by saying that Jude is an optimist. At the end, when he attempted to starve himself to death as he was grieving the death of Willem, after his loved ones staged an intervention, Jude was made to go to therapy. And he, for the first time in his life, actually takes it seriously, hoping that it's not too late. Maybe he can be repaired. This made me hopeful, even though there are only 20 pages left of this book at that point, only to find out in the final chapter told from Harold's perspective that Jude has killed himself. And I'm not saying that there needs to be this happy ending, because I don't think people like Jude can ever reach a state of normalcy after everything that they have been through. But every time Jude tries to better himself, Yanagihara throws something more horrific at him. It's like she's sitting around going, what's the worst thing that can happen to Jude right now? And does that. Like, there was this one point around the end of the novel when things really began to look up for Jude. His legs had to be amputated, but he had prosthetics and he was settling in them nicely. He was in a loving relationship with Willem. There was a lot of love and support around them. It got me thinking, man, things have been going really good for Jude. Almost suspiciously good. It would be a shame if something really bad were to happen right now, like if Willem just died out of nowhere. And then he does! Now, I do want to give credit where it's due. Despite having done no research on Jude, Yanagihara described his symptoms, the things that he experienced as a result of his trauma, pretty well. Especially after his incident with Caleb that reopened a lot of old wounds, the descriptions of him getting flashbacks, getting nightmares was done to a T. He would be at home, making himself dinner or at a movie with Willem, and suddenly a scene from his months with Caleb would appear. And then there would be a scene from the home, and a scene from his years with brother Luke, and then a scene from his months with Dr. Trailer, and then a scene from the injury, the headlights' white glare, his head jerking to the side, and then his mind would fill with images, banshees demanding his attention, snatching and tearing at him with their long, needly fingers. Caleb had unleashed something within him, and he was unable to coax the beasts back into their dungeon. He was made aware of how much time he actually spent controlling his memories, how much concentration it took, how fragile his command over them had been all along. He felt sometimes as if his months with Caleb were a pack of hyenas, and every day they chased him, and every day he spent all his energy running from them, trying to escape being devoured by their snapping, foaming jaws. All the things that had helped in the past, the concentration, the cutting, weren't helping now. As someone who does suffer from trauma and would regularly get flashbacks and nightmares at one point in my life, this hit home. The chain of events, how being triggered by one thing can remind you of other terrible memories, trying to escape, trying to run away from it all, especially how she compared these memories to vicious creatures like banshees and hyenas is, I thought, was so apt. But there's nothing that ever comes out of it. Jude remains stuck in his past, even as he grows older. The fourth chapter, titled The Axiom of Equality, is a reflection of this. Axiom of Equality states that X will always equal X, it never changes, just like Jude, who never changes. The person that he was will always be the person that he is. His external environment may change. He may have a reputable job, an apartment in New York, hobbies, a loving partner, supportive friends and family, family, but internally, he is still that 15-year-old boy who was abused. At some point, he laments this about himself by saying how he wishes he too could forget, that he too could choose never to consider Caleb again. Always he wonders why and how he has let 4 months increasingly distant for him, so affect him, so alter his life. But then he might as well ask, as he often does, why has he let the first 15 years of his life so dictate the past 28? At this point, I wanted to scream at the book, like, Jude, no, you don't have to live like this. Get help. There is help available for people like you. The only time Jude actually gets help is when he starts seeing a therapist named Dr. Lohaman. But it didn't sound like he was very helpful to him, and it's not because Dr. Lohaman was a bad therapist or that he just wasn't a good fit for Jude or anything like that, but because the whole nature of therapy is presented as flawed and ineffective. He found himself doubting therapy, its premises, for the first time. He began to see the sinister pedantry of therapy, its suggestion that life was somehow repairable, that there existed a societal norm and that the patient was being guided towards conforming to it. Therapy is not supposed to repair your life, because no matter how much trauma you have been through, you are not something broken that needs to be fixed, that needs to be repaired, that needs to be saved. What therapy does is gives you tools to deal with it, to manage those issues, to give you the power to cope with things the healthy way. Because after all, life goes on. You can't stop bad things from happening to you, but what you can control is how you cope and manage those things. Yanagihara herself has said in the past that she doesn't believe in talk therapy. By that, I'm guessing she means cognitive behavior therapy or CBT. Now, I have mixed feelings about this because I too have had bad experiences with CBT, but I also know people whose lives were saved because of it. But when it comes to intense trauma like what Jude experienced, I don't think CBT would be the most effective. Rather, something like EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, something that is specifically designed for trauma patients, would be much more fitting. But I still wouldn't say that I don't believe in it, because what do you mean by that? Therapy is not some mythical thing like God or Tooth Fairy or Santa Claus. This is something that has been around for decades with a ton of scientific research backing it up. And while CBT or talk therapy may be the most common form of therapy, it is not the only form of therapy that there is. There are so many different ways, so many different therapy types, so many different tools that is out there now to help yourself. And therapy is a very personal thing. If the therapist that you've been working with hasn't been very helpful, then just get a new one. Again, Jude has the means to do so. But Yanagihara doesn't provide any of these alternatives. Instead, all we get is a lousy therapist that acts pretentious towards Jude, and that's that. Also, I find it interesting how one of the most villainous characters of this novel, Dr. Trailer, the one who kept Jude trapped in his basement, who used him as a sex slave and ran him over with his car when he was 15 years old, was a psychiatrist. Like, other than Dr. Lohaman, the only other representation of actual psychiatry professional that we get is a literal monster that has left Jude disfigured. The only thing that actually seems to help Jude, that provides some escape, is when he attempts to take his life. Which brings me to the point that made me initially put down this book 2 years ago when I started reading this. Even from early on, I was able to sense that this book was going a very specific direction that I really was not comfortable with. So, after the whole incident with Caleb that ends up reopening a lot of old wounds, Jude attempts to take his life. Now, the scene of this attempt, the level of detail that it was described with, it left me shocked. And it wasn't just detailed in the sense that it was describing what was happening, but also how to actually do it. I'm obviously not going to show you anything or read it out to you, but the amount of detail it was written with, it felt like I was reading an instruction manual. There was information on what to use, where to cut, how deep to cut, what veins to cut through. I literally had to put the book down and stare in space for a good couple seconds, wondering, why is this here? Because up until this point, everything that we've read so far had a purpose. Jude's past with Brother Luke, the motels, Dr. Trailer, helps to understand how he turned out the way that he did. The graphic depictions of his suffering and pain is meant to emphasize how his trauma is still affecting his life to this day. But this... Why did we need to know this? Did we really need the step-by-step instructions on how to slit your wrists? All of this left me wondering, what kind of message is Yanagihara trying to promote with this book? Where healthy methods of coping and healing like therapy is demonized, but self-harming, attempting to kill yourself is justified? Where even after you manage to turn your life around, the things that most people can only dream of, you're still defined by your past? And what about the people that actually has lived through the things that Jude has? What kind of message are you sending to them? That no matter how successful they become, how much they achieve, how much money they make, how many friends and family they have, that they're still worthless and should just kill themselves? And turns out that's exactly what she's trying to do. Yanagihara further goes on to say in the same interview with Electric Literature, one of the things that makes me most suspicious about therapy is its insistence that life is always the answer. Every other medical specialty devoted to the care of the seriously ill recognizes that at some point the doctor's job is to help the patient die, that there are points at which death is preferable to life. That doesn't mean every doctor will help you get there, of course, but almost every doctor of the critically sick understand the patient's right to refuse treatment, to choose death over life. But psychology and psychiatry insist that life is the meaning of life, so to speak, and that if one can't be repaired, one can at least find a way to stay alive, to keep growing older. I mean, she said it right there. If you have been through the things that Jude has been through, death is preferable to life. Doesn't matter how much you try, how much you change, how much you've turned your life around, you will always be defined by what happened to you. Combine this with the fact that there is literally a manual on how to kill yourself in this novel. I don't think I even need to get into how dangerous of a message this is. And the fact that this book was trending on TikTok, a lot of young people are getting their hands on this, is terrifying. I mean, it already is as bad as it is, but when you add on the context of Jude being a gay man, this novel being praised as this great gay novel, this is absolutely horrendous. Yanagihara's first novel, The People in the Trees, published in 2013, explores the life of a scientist named Dr. Abraham Norton Perina. Norton was a gay man who took an anthropological mission to the fictional island of Eijuba, I think that's how it's pronounced, with a group of other scientists. There they come across a tribe that publicly rape a 10-year-old boy as a village ritual. Norton later on pursues a relationship with this 10-year-old boy, then years later decides to adopt him and some other boys from this tribe. Norton sexually abuses all of the boys that he adopted, and the novel ends with him being convicted for child sexual abuse. But in the end, it was said that he escaped his parole officer, so despite committing such heinous crimes, he's still out and about, living freely in society. To Paradise, which is Yanagihara's most recent novel, published just in 2022, explores a similar dynamic among gay men. It's written in 3 sections, all set in the city of New York, but during different time periods, 1893, 1993, and 2093 respectively. All 3 sections are told from the perspectives of gay male characters who were suffering in some way or another in terms of their sexuality, whether it be through shame, sexual repression, or sexual abuse. Like, the character in the 1993 section is living through the AIDS epidemic where he is a carrier, and he's just frivolously living around with as many men as he could, spreading his HIV virus and killing people. Now, I haven't actually read The People in the Trees or To Paradise, I just read the plot summary off of Wikipedia. But to me, it seems like the themes in A Little Life is not a one-off thing when it comes to Hanya Yanagihara. Rather, she seems to have a thing for gay men and boys suffering and being tortured in that sort of sexually abusive way, as this is the thing that she predominantly writes about. Now, obviously, I am not a gay man, but I am queer, and I'm just so sick and tired of people glorifying queer pain, this sort of idea that being queer is inherently synonymous with suffering. Also, the way Yanagihara seems to be obsessed with gay men being raped and sexually abused. Like, every single novel that she has written has at least one scene of a gay man getting raped. It's just so fucking weird. Especially given that she herself is obviously not a gay man. She's not even queer for that matter. It is said that she has only been romantically interested in men. Now, I'm not bringing this up to say that, or if you're a straight author, you can never write about gay characters. No, because we live in a free society where you have free will, where you have the freedom of expression to write about whatever you want. But I am not the first person to have a problem with this. Many people have raised concerns about Yanagihara being a straight woman profiting off of gay men's suffering, to which Yanagihara has responded very defensively by saying, I have the right to write about whatever I want. Which, yeah, you do, nobody is saying that you don't, but where it does become a problem is when you try to speak over the people that you're writing about, that you're supposedly representing, especially if they're a marginalized group who has been silenced throughout history. Most people that are praising this book, pushing this as this great gay novel, are not even gay themselves. In fact, most queer people, gay men especially, absolutely hate this book, because it's not just that Jude suffers in this book, but also how he suffers. I mean, honestly, I'm surprised that there was no mention of Jude having AIDS or getting HIV from one of his encounters, because if you think about it, Yanagihara has ticked off every other box when it comes to negative stereotypes about gay men, about them being hypersexual, them being pedophiles and groomers, them carrying diseases, them being these broken, traumatized people that cannot be saved no matter what. Like I said, most gay men hate this book because of all these negative stereotypes that it perpetuates. I mean, other than Jude's relationship with Willem, which doesn't even occur till we're 2/3 of the way of this book, what exactly is gay about this? The pedophilia, the ongoing sexual abuse, self-harm, diseases, suffering to the magnitude of which there is no escape other than death? Is this what you think being gay is about? And speaking of Jude's relationship with Willem, them deciding to get into a romantic relationship is something that I least expected, because keep in mind that these two have been friends pretty much their entire adult lives. They have been friends since the start of the novel, and at no point there was any hint that they might be into each other. Willem at no point didn't even have a little crush on Jude. He did not seem to be interested in him romantically. If anything, it was their friendship that was highlighted. Like, this novel was promoted as this moving tale about friendship between four young men, which later on becomes just about Willem and Jude, like I said earlier. And early on in the novel, Willem was very adamant on just staying friends with Jude. Their friendship, the bond that they had between them, was so strong that it was described as codependent by others, but Willem did not care at all. Lately, he had been wondering if codependence was such a bad thing. He took pleasure in his friendships, and it didn't hurt anyone, so who cared if it was codependent or not? And anyway, how was a friendship any more codependent than a relationship? Why was it admirable when you were 27, but creepy when you were 37? Why wasn't friendship as good as a relationship? Why wasn't it even better? It was two people who remained together day after day, bound not by sex or physical attraction or money or children or property, but only by the shared agreement to keep going, the mutual dedication to a union that could never be codified. Friendship was witnessing another's slow drip of miseries and long bouts of boredom and occasional triumphs. It was feeling honored by the privilege of getting to be present for another person's most dismal moments and knowing that you could be dismal around him in return. When I first read this paragraph, it left me so excited to read on and learn more about their friendship because, we don't get much representations of platonic love in the media. I was looking forward to what I hoped to be the much-needed Ero-esque representation where Willem and Jude get to find their own meaning of what it means to be in a partnership without any societal bounds or expectations. If anything, it was alluded that Willem saw bits of his late brother Hemming in Jude since they both suffered from a disability that he cared for. So to go from that to a romantic relationship, then a sexual one where Willem quite literally pressures Jude into having sex with him was so jarring. It also felt like lazy writing. Like, instead of trying to develop this unconventional style of relationship, Yanagihara chose to take the easy route of romance, something that has been done for centuries. And to kill off Willem later on with an unexpected car accident right after they got into this relationship seems to have been deliberately done in order to hurt Jude in the maximum way possible, because had they been just friends, it probably wouldn't have been as devastating since he also loses Malcolm in the same accident. But to lose his lover, the only person that Jude ever trusted and felt comfortable with, makes sure that Jude suffers in the worst way possible. And that's really what this book is about. It's torture porn with some plot and rainbow sprinkles thrown over it. I really did not get the hype over this book. Like, yeah, Yanagihara's writing can be engaging at times, but is this really worth this much hype? Is this really deserving of being in the same level as timeless classics like To Kill a Mockingbird and 1984? Are we even talking about the same book? What's up with all this hype? What do people even see in this? Why is this so popular? Around 2 years ago, when this book went viral on TikTok, people were posting themselves bawling their eyes out reading this book. I think it unintentionally ended up creating some kind of a challenge on how far you can get through this book without crying or having a mental breakdown, which I found to be pretty disrespectful given the contents of this book. I personally did not cry. I didn't even feel sad for that matter. I was just mostly angry. But I do think it's interesting how we as a society can have an obsession with being sad. Some people have this idea in their head that the sadder a piece of media is, the more poignant, traumatizing it is, the higher in quality it is. And I don't even want to get into why that is. That is like beyond my scope of understanding. But while A Little Life is poignant and potent in the sense that it stays in your head for a while even after you've finished the book, in this case, it's not really a good thing. Say with A Series of Unfortunate Events, for example, that I brought up earlier, it is very similar as in they both explore the theme of compounded trauma where you keep having one bad thing happening after the other. But with A Series of Unfortunate Events, underneath all this trauma, there is hope. There is a meaning. Throughout all these hardships, Klaus, Violet, and Sunny continue to move forward displaying resilience, and we get that satisfying ending at the end. With A Little Life, on the other hand, it's just suffering for the sake of suffering. There is no meaning, nothing is ever done to actually help Jude get out of his misery. It's like Yanagihara wrote down a list of the worst possible things to happen to a person and turned it into a story. The amount of sexual abuse in this book and the way it was used as a cheap shock value really gets distasteful after a while. Again, there is no meaning, no message that comes out of it aside from, well, life is pretty shit, so you should probably kill yourself. Here's how to do it. A Little Life has garnered quite a bit of female audience. Most people that seem to absolutely love this book are young girls, and I wanted to explore a bit as to why that is. The things that Jude goes through in this novel, things like sexual abuse and rape, are typically the things that women go through. Not saying that it can't happen to men, but it disproportionately affects women. But Jude as a man going through the things that usually happen to women, such as sexual abuse, rape, abusive power dynamics, codependency, even down to the method of suicide that he uses, slitting your wrists is a method that is commonly undertaken by women attempting suicide. All of this make him relatable to a young female audience. They see a bit of themselves in Jude when he goes through these things and the aftermath of it, feeling things like shame, low self-esteem, having trust issues. Which begs the question, had Jude been a woman, would he still receive the same amount of sympathy and support that he has? I might sound cynical, but I don't think he would. Because like I said, sexual abuse is something that typically happens to women. It is normalized in a lot of ways. Misogyny, abuse towards women happens so much in our society that we're desensitized to it. The things that happen to Jude are not an exception, unfortunately, because there are plenty of women and girls that live through the things that he has been through or even worse, but it is an exception because it happens to him. Because when you think of your typical victim of rape or sexual assault, a wealthy, attractive, cis male lawyer who volunteers at an art organization and lives in New York is probably not the first thing that comes to mind. And this brings me to my next question. Who exactly is this book for? Who is Yanagihara's intended audience? It's not gay men, for sure, because like I said, most gay men hate this book. It's not survivors of abuse and trauma, because Yanagihara admitted to doing no research on that. To answer this, I decided to look into the people that are praising this book. First, we have Garth Greenwell, who famously referred to A Little Life as the great gay novel. Greenwell is an American novelist who studied music, who has an arts degree in the State University of New York at Purchase. Then he got his master's in literature from Harvard, where he also completed his PhD. He has then taught at various private schools, became a professor and academic at various universities all around the world. John McCoud from The New Yorker, who compared Yanagihara to Tolstoy, is a writer and librarian from New Jersey. He got his master's in library and information sciences from Pratt Institute, which is a private university in Brooklyn of New York. There is also this article by Caroline Leavitt from San Francisco Chronicle who had this to say about A Little Life. It's not hyperbole to call this novel a masterwork. If anything, that word is simply too little for it. Leavitt is also a novelist and a New York Times bestseller who teaches at both Stanford and UCLA. Obviously, there are a lot more people who praise this book, but so far they've all had one thing in common. They all come from incredibly privileged backgrounds. Being able to study arts, writing, entertainment in this economy at such a high level, I don't care how talented or smart you may be, for you to even get there, you'd have to have come from some form of privilege. And this is who this book is really for. It's this really subgenre of queer people, especially cis white gay men, who are otherwise incredibly wealthy and privileged, belonging to the class of bourgeoisie academic liberals living in some of the richest places on earth. And Jude is a representation of that. The reason they're okay with negative stereotypes about gay people is because they're protected from it. They will never have to suffer the consequences of it. This book is essentially them patting themselves on the back as they romanticize trauma and abuse, as they glorify the things that they never had to live through and would probably never will. Which is why some parts of this novel felt so foreign to me, because it's not meant for normal everyday people like me and you. It's meant for the privileged, the bourgeoisie, who sit in their comfortable houses in New York as they gawk over the rabble, pretending to understand, or worse, try to tell me about what it's like to live through the things that I have experienced firsthand. I'm just so done with this book. Now, I do want to make it clear that everything that I've said so far in this video is nothing new. I've had all these thoughts and ideas marinating inside of me for the past 2 years when I picked up this book. I was desperate for anything, for anyone to say something. I went scrounging all over the internet hoping to find something that speaks up about all these issues with the book. Instead, all I got was all this praise, all this critical acclaim, people saying that this is the great gay novel. It felt like I was going nuts. So in a lot of ways, this video was very cathartic for me to make. Up until this point, I've been screaming into a void for 2 years. Well, I still am screaming into a void. There is no one here in this room with me. But as you can probably tell, this video has been particularly difficult to put together, not just because of the heavy subject matter, not just because I literally had to face some of my inner demons because of how triggered I was, but also to go so against what seems to be the mainstream opinion of this book has been pretty daunting, but I know I'm not the only one who feels this way. I mentioned LuKremBo's video at the start. His video really gave me the push to finally start writing this, so I highly recommend you go watch his video. We'll have it linked in the description. Doing the research for this video, I also came across videos made by other creators like Man Carrying Thing and Olivia's Catastrophe. There are people that are speaking up, especially a lot of queer content creators. So if you're somebody that have held this sort of unpopular opinions about this book, please know that you're not alone. I hope that this video resonated or validated you in some way. And if you're somebody that did enjoy this book, then that's fine too. You like what you like. I'm not here to attack that. But I hope at the very least you are still able to understand where I'm coming from. I do want to end on a positive note and say that the play that I watched in preparation for this video, the one held in Amsterdam that I've been playing clips from throughout this video, I really enjoyed it. I loved the actors, I loved the set. In particular, I liked how they used the same actor for Jude even when playing scenes from his past, from his childhood, as opposed to, say, hiring a child actor. It emphasizes how he's still stuck in that past. I actually liked everything that I've come out of this book. The play, the fan arts, the recipes, everything is great except for the book itself, which I thought was pretty shit. So yeah, that's pretty much it. If you had made it this far, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment, let me know what queer book recommendations you have, because I would definitely need a palate cleanser after reading that garbage. Again, happy Pride Month if you celebrated, and if it's already past Pride Month, I hope you had a good month. This is probably the longest video I've ever made, so again, thanks a lot for watching. Leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I don't want to hear about a little life ever again.